Hello everyone, today we are going to speak about minimal surfaces. And what we mean by minimal surfaces is that we are going to use soap bubbles. So let's start with a surface from Rhino. I can bring it in my Rhino using set one surface, and let's hide it inside my Rhino. Now I'm going to use a mesh surface component and make a mesh with a U and V value of whatever seems to be working. So now this is my mesh, and I want to use this mesh to make a kangaroo definition and work it and run it to get my desired result. First of all, I'm defining the anchor points, and for the start, let's consider these points on the corners. So I'm using mesh corners, and use anchor. So these are the points, and the strength for them, I'm starting with 100. So these are the anchors. Now we should also use a show, as we also discussed in the previous video, because we want to see the result of the mesh. The other thing we also spoke about in the previous video was edge length, because we want this mesh to take the length of these edges and do not just crack or make disappear. And the strength for it also, let's work on 100, then we can change these numbers. Now if I just use this, let's see what we can have. So we can use a solver or Bouncy Solver, and I'm going to merge all these outputs of show, anchor, and also mesh edge lengths, and I'm defining them as the goal objects. But before that, let's use a Boolean toggle and put the on off, because I don't want it to run at the moment of connecting this. And also using a button in here. So now if I connect it and hide all these parts. Okay, now if I turn this on, and let's see what we will have. It doesn't make any output, and the reason is that there is no load. And for that we will use a soap bubble, because we want to have a minimal surface. So there are two types of them, soap film and live soap. Let's work with soap film. And if I connect this mesh, let's put it on false and connect the mesh, and this strength, let's also work with something like 10, then we can change it. And if now I connect this one also, let's see what will be the result. Now we can see that this makes some kind of load that has changed the output of what we had, and you saw the difference between having it or just working with these parts. So we can see that this strength is now a lot, so let's make it a little less. Or we can also change these numbers. The mesh edge length, if we decrease this number, you can also see that it makes the changes more visible, or we can make it higher. And also the points can have a less strength or higher. and this results in the difference in the final mesh. So just this was in a flat base surface as we had it in here. What if we work on a surface that is not flat? Or before continuing to that part, let's just work with another kind of mesh which we also spoke about in the previous tutorial. So now here let's use a 3D remesh in here. So let's use this mesh and put the length on something like 3. Oh, that's too small, so let's change it to 12 or 10 or even higher. Let's work with 25. Okay, now if I use this new mesh and connect all the connected parts to this output, to this triangulation, now you can see that the result will be different. And now let's just make it visible. So you can see that now it's more strict. It can't be changed very freely as it was before. So now if I add to this number, put it on maybe 40, you can see the difference. Now it's beginning to be more free compared to the previous one. And also we can change other things like the anchor points. So instead of corners, now let's use naked vertices. And if I use these naked points, now let's see what's the difference. It's not so much different. If I change these numbers or this, or if I increase this soap film strength, you can see that now it's making some kind of changes. So as I increase this number, you can see that it's starting to deform the surface, the mesh, but again it's just flat. So now we want to work with something not flat, some kind of a Brep. So I can again make it just from the rhino. So let's work with the surface. Now I want to make the points of the surface, and now I want to change the placement of these points so that I can have a 3D surface. So this is what we have. And now I want to define this new surface as the input for my code. So let's hide it inside my rhino, and I have it inside my grasshopper. I can also see the 3D remesh, or I can also change it to 3D quad, or also use this first mesh. But for now let's just work with this one. And also I define the naked points, which are these points in the border of the mesh, as my anchor points. And also we have a soap film. So now let's see how this has changed this surface. Okay, you can see that now it's some kind of different from what it was in the flat part. And we can again use these corner points as the supports. so that it has more effect on the mesh. You can see that it somehow it's just breaking it. So if I decrease this number, now this is different. It is making some kind of fabric behavior for this surface. Then you can just change these numbers to have results that is more desirable for you. But this is the basics of how things should be connected to each other to make this kind of behavior. And the other things that we can do is that we can define some points between them so that it works as a kind of pile for our fabric structure. So let's define these, but before that I'm going to just make this false and also hide it. Okay, so now I have this mesh, or this one that I used, and I want to define some points on this mesh. So if I use this naked points and naked vertices component, I want to take some of the edge points or the interior points which we have in here, these points, and I want to select just one of them using a list item. And let's see what we will have. So if I hide this one and use a list item index, you can see that now this point is selected, but I can also just change the placement. So this one, I want this point to work as a force and take the fabric up. So I can define it as an anchor, or also I can define it as a point load. So if I use this point load, I can define this point. The force vector would be Z, and the weighting. So I can also define a number for this one, something like 12. And if I also connect it to here, so let's add one other input for our merge and connect this one. So this would be a force for this point. And now let's just hide this part. And also I want to show this point because this is my force. And now if I make this boolean on true, let's see how it has changed. So this number is still very low, and let's add some numbers to the weighting. You can see that it has started to change the fabric that we have in here, change the mesh from this point. So I can just change this number to see how much it has affected the fabric. I can also change this factor on -x so that it just changes the direction. So now you can see that it's going down instead of going up. And also I can change this index. So let's come back to make it back to just going up, and a little decrease this number. And now we can change this input. Now if I refresh it, you can see now different point is selected. Okay, this was using a basic surface that we had in here, some kind of anti-plastic surface. But now let's use another Brep. So let's hide it in here and define two surfaces inside our rhino. I want to make a hole inside them, so let's go to the top, or I can just change it in here. Going to top, define a circle in here, and yeah, I want to have its effect on the upper surface and trim it by. Okay, so now I have it, and I can also connect this one using a loft to this one, or I can duplicate edge, duplicate this one, and now I can lock them together. So now let's just merge everything together or join them together. Okay, now we have a total Brep, and I can define this Brep inside my Grasshopper. Now let's hide it inside our rhino, and now if I just connect this new Brep to this inputs, we cannot get the desired result. That's because it's not a surface, it's now a Brep. So instead we also spoke about a mesh Brep, and the settings that can be used for it. So let's just change the placement and find the settings. Yeah, it's in here in the utilities. It's custom, and we can connect these settings to the mesh Brep, and then we can just change these numbers. Okay, let's say this is what we want this mesh to be. And also we spoke about making a quad mesh. So I'm using Remesh Quad or Quad Remesh. I connect this mesh. You can see now it's better. But we also spoke about it in the previous video, that we can have some kind of a quad remesh settings. Yeah, it's in here. You can also find it inside this part of triangulation, quad remesh, and I can connect it. And then we can change how many mesh parts we want to have. Now it's on 100, 1000. Let's put it on 500 because we don't want our file to crash, because as we increase this number of edges, it makes it more hard to process for the Windows, for the computer. So now we have this mesh, and let's just connect it to the same output that we have in here. So I can just copy this part and or just add this output to this one. it's easier to do it. Okay, so now let's just hide this part, and let's see what we have defined for it. So these points for the corners are just these points, so I think it doesn't make sense because we also have to define this part. And let's see what the naked points makes as a result. Yeah, that seems to be better. So I'm going to define these points as the anchor points instead of these corners. And the other things is that we had a point load in here. Maybe we can just skip this part for now. Maybe we add it next. And also we have this soap film. So let's see what's the result. Let's hide all these parts, and yeah, now it's working as a minimal surface for these anchor points and this mesh. And as we told, we can just increase this strength of the soap film. You can see that now it's making more effect on the mesh. And also we can change other parts, like changing the strength of the anchors. You can see that now they're more strict to the points. We can change the strength of this mesh edge length, add to it or decrease it. You can see as we decrease it, it starts to change more visibly. Okay, and also we could change this number of mesh. If I decrease it to 400 and then refresh it, you can see the difference. If now I put it on something like 600, it makes the mesh to be more smooth, more working like a fabric. And now I can also add this point load that we spoke about, and let's put it on somewhere like let's add to the number. There's other ways to make this part. We can yeah, let's just change this. Okay, so I'm going to turn this quad mesh on. I want to see it, and I want to define one point in here, and I should also put it really similar, very close to this mesh that I have. So I'm going to place it somewhere in here, and then making it close to this mesh. Now I'm going to add this point as a attractor point. So I'm going to put a name on it, attractor point. Oh, sorry. And make it more visible inside my code using a different color for it, and also make it like a circle. Now I want to make I want to find the closest point from these points, from these closed points that we had in here. So just let's put them, replace them to this part. and I want to find the one point in this all clothed points that is most close to this attractor point. And let's also use a custom preview because I want this point to be visible from and distinguished from other points using a color swatch. And set the color on black. So now we can see this attractor point, and we want to use a closest point. Yeah, this is the closest point. So we want to search in this cloud of points and search for this one point, the closest to this. And it's selecting this point as the output, so that's what we will use as the point load placement. So instead of using this manually part using a list item, we can define this closest point as the input for our point load. And now let's connect this one to the merge inputs, and now let's just hide all parts and also hide it inside our Rhino and see the result of our mesh. Okay, now you can see that we have some kind of point load in here, which we can also increase its strength. We can also change its placement because we had this point selected in here. Okay. So if I just change its placement, yeah, using this vectors gumball and refreshing the code, you can see now we have the different points for the point load of our fabric. We could also change it to somewhere near the borders, near the point anchor points. That's also making something different. So that's it. This is the whole basics of what we could make using a surface from Rhino or a Brep from Rhino and define it as the basics for our minimal surface. I hope you enjoyed it and see you in the next tutorials.